Hi, I'm Dervla McTiernan and I'm an author. Yes, my new book is called The Murder Rule. Looks like that. And it follows the story of Hannah Rokeby. Hannah is a young, idealistic law student. She joins the Innocence Project on the eve of their biggest case. They're trying to save an innocent man from death row. And at first glance, Hannah appears to be exactly what you'd expect. Very clever, ambitious, but sort of eager to please her professors, the kind of young person who wants to change the world. Of course, if you scrape beneath the surface, Hannah's not like that at all. She's quite a bit darker. She's ruthless, I would say, and she's definitely working for her own agenda. The Innocence Project is a kind of loosely affiliated group, sets of groups of lawyers who work pro bono for indigent prisoners, so prisoners who can't afford their own legal representation. And they first kind of came to real prominence when DNA testing became available, because they finally had a method that they could use to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that people who were on death row, or in fact had even been executed in some situations, were entirely innocent. And so that sort of brought them a lot more publicity and a lot more visibility. But over the years, they've done incredible work freeing people who shouldn't be in prison, and also kind of working to reform the system from the inside out, trying to improve things systemically that will have a larger impact across the board. This book started with an article I read quite a few years ago about a young Irish law student who went to the US for the summer and volunteered for the Innocence Project. And when she came back to Ireland, she couldn't let go of the case that she'd been working. So she kept trying to progress it, making phone calls, trying to track people down. And eventually she found a retired police detective. And that person pointed her to some evidence that had been hidden from the defence in the original case. And as a result of her work, a man who'd spent more than 20 years in prison was freed. And I thought that was incredibly inspirational. You know, I mean, just amazing that this had happened. And I couldn't help but contrast her experience with mine. I had been a young Irish law student in America, but I had worked as a chambermaid and a waitress and basically had a good time. And here she was changing the world effectively. But I didn't think there was any story for me there. There's nothing there for me to write. The story had been told. It was only a few years later. And I can't remember if I just came across the article or if it was on my mind and I went and found it again. But I started to research a bit more. And I found out that after she found that hidden evidence, it took another 5 years for the case to be heard. At which point, Walter Swift had been in prison for 26 years. And there were only 3 years left to run his original sentence. And it was so sad. And it was so dark. And I just thought, why was the sanitized version the one that was spread across the newspapers? You know, this clean story, when the real story was so much more complicated. And I thought, well, maybe the editors preferred the more inspirational take. And there was no reason for me to think this except my own dark and twisted mind, but what if the Innocence Project had some sophisticated PR team? And they were sending out the more inspirational story into the world because it would get more eyes and therefore more support potentially. And then I thought, well, would I even blame them if that's what they were doing? Probably not, because what they're trying to do is change the world and nobody really cares. And what would you do in that situation? You know, would you take a step off that perfectly straight and narrow path? And once you've done that, then do you take the next step? And then do you take the next step? And where does that lead you? And that's where I thought I might have a story to tell. It is a piece of law. The murder rule refers to the felony murder rule, which is very definitely a piece of American legislation that is interpreted differently depending on which state you're in. So some states have more safeguards than others. What it basically means is if you commit a felony and somebody dies while that felony is being committed, you can be found guilty of murder, even if you had no direct impact. So two of the odder convictions I came across, in one situation, a man committed an armed robbery with his friend. And he committed the armed robbery. He was caught, he was handcuffed, he was placed in the back of the police car. And while he was sitting in the police car with his hands behind his back, the police officer shot his friend dead. And the guy in handcuffs was found guilty of felony murder because the death had happened in the course of a felony. An even odder one was a young man who went to a party. A friend of a friend approached him and said, "Can I borrow your car?" And if you believe the prosecution, he was told what the guy wanted to do with the car, which is to go to a woman's house that he knew. I think he'd had a relationship with her maybe. He said, "She's got my stuff. I want to get my stuff back. And if she's not there, I'm going to break in and take it." So the guy who loaned the car went home, went to bed, fell asleep. The guy who borrowed the car went to the woman's house, broke in. She was there with a male friend. There was a fight and he killed the male friend. The guy at home in bed was convicted of felony murder. And I believe he even spent more time in prison than the guy who had actually done the killing. So it results in these really weird kind of situations. The reason it worked for the book is because I was very interested in this idea of responsibility. How responsible is Hannah, my protagonist, for the outcomes of her actions? Yes, for everything she could foresee. What about the things she didn't foresee? What about the things she didn't foresee but should have if she had been doing the work, And so it seemed to fit the book that way. But I've since been told that there's a version of the felony murder rule in Australia. I have to do a bit more research into that. But yes, the prosecutor who came to one of the talks said, we've got a version of that here. So I need to do a bit more reading about that one. No, this is number 4. I felt I got the opportunity to finish that series, that 3-book arc. By the time I was writing The Scholar, it felt like a 3-book arc to me. And I was very comfortable with where I kind of ended that. And I really wanted to write this story. This story was on my mind and I was desperate to write it. And it felt very freeing to be able to write anything. That doesn't mean I would never go back to Cormac, because I think I will. But I think he needs to be about 5 years older. His life needs to have moved on since we last saw him. So there's more to work with. And I need to be a little bit older. So knowing that I could come back whenever, and knowing that I felt I'd completed that series, meant that I could be just happy and excited to write something totally fresh. Oh, this is not too scary. Are you a night owl or an early bird? Oh my God. Against my will, I think I'm both. I'm at my best when I go to bed at a set time. Like if I go to bed at 10 p.m. every night, then I'm more productive, I'm happier, I'm more relaxed. The more kind of stressed I get, it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. I don't want to go to bed because then the next day starts and then I'm more tired and so on. I'm always an early bird because the kids have always been like 5:30, 6 a.m. starters. And so for years now, that's been where I've ended up as well. Yes, I'm a full-time author. Have been since just before The Scholar was published. No, I was a lawyer for 12 years in Ireland. And then by the time we moved from Ireland, I was absolutely determined never to practice law again. So I did work in a kind of quasi-legal role because those were the skills I had. I worked for the Mental Health Commission in Perth and I wrote negotiated contracts for mental health services. So that's the job I was doing when I started, I was writing a little bit before that, but when I really was serious about writing. And that's the job I was still doing when I became a full-time author. It was actually really hard to leave it because of all the jobs I've ever done. I loved that one. I loved the people I worked with. We had this really close-knit team. It felt like the work actually mattered. And it was weird because you dream about leaving your day job and being a full-time writer. And probably any other job I'd done beforehand, I would have skipped out the door, But this one, it was hard. I was torn, It was neither. It was very considered because we'd already been through a really rough time financially. We'd had our ups and downs and big challenges and we would not have taken a risk again. But we were out one night on a date night, which was to go to a forensics talk that I dragged my husband along to. And we were sitting there having a drink beforehand and we were looking at each other going, we've barely spoken to each other. We are working every single hour there is and we've been doing this for too many years. What are we waiting for? We were just afraid to take even the most measured risk because we'd already been through a lot. And so it took us kind of looking at each other going, wow, we've barely seen each other, to go, no, it's actually time. It's past time. Let's do it. And I knew I could go back to work if I had to. If in a couple of years I could go back to work. And I always think like that. I'm always counting how many years I can be really confident that I have left. And I always try to keep it at 3. But I've always got a plan B, You have to have an escape route if things go wrong. Because no author goes like this. There are very few careers that even go like this. It's mostly like this. You've got to be prepared for that, I think. No, not at all. I mean, you would know, Katie, what it was like. I mean, I grew up in Ireland in the 80s and 90s and my parents were very supportive, but they absolutely wanted me to get a job where I could pay my bills. And the idea of writing would have been like the most irresponsible thing. I might as well have gone and been a stripper or something. I mean, they just would have thought, what? That's crazy. You're never going to be able to support yourself. And I was the kind of person who would never have rocked the boat. Like it took me a long time to kind of grow out of that trying to please everybody thing. And so studying law, like I went into my first year as a lawyer or as a law student, and I knew from day one I didn't fit. I just thought, oh my God, everybody knows the names of high court judges. Like, this is crazy. I don't belong here. So I did a 4-year degree, 2 years in law school and practiced law for 12 years, which will tell you a lot about who I was at that stage of my life, My husband, Kenny, reads for me when I ask him to. And he doesn't read a whole lot, but he's got very good story instincts. But he tends to read in bed on his iPad. So I'm always looking for this where he goes, he's falling asleep. And then I'm looking, where were you when you fell asleep? And that gives me a few hints as well. But he's great. He's always been, from the beginning, we've always, I used to take one night off. Thursday night, I used to take off writing. And we would open a bottle of wine and we would chat about it. And I would pick his brains about what he thought about this plot idea or the other. And we still do that when we can. Not really. I'm very happy to edit, very happy to rewrite, very happy to go and do promotional stuff. And I love the actual writing itself. So there's no part. I mean, if there's a part that I dread, it's every day, the first half hour, because I have to look at my own work and that's excruciating. You've got to get past that moment where you're just like, oh my God, I feel an almost aversion, And then once I get over my own self-consciousness and that judgment, and when I'm in the story again, I'm really enjoying it. But getting over that little hump at the beginning every day is hard. And I think that's the main reason most writers procrastinate, is for something, that anxiety that comes from knowing that it's not there yet and feeling all the feelings that come with that. I have one very good writing buddy, and probably that would be the closest thing, Sarah Foster. Sarah and I met before I was published. She was 4 books in, I think, at that stage. But we just hit it off. And she's always been incredibly supportive. And we really support each other. But we've never really done that. We're both quite independent. And when I was starting out, I had a choice. I could join writers' groups and learn to use social media. Or I could write. Because I didn't have time to do everything. And I just said, well, I've got to make a choice. So I'm going to spend my time writing. And the rest of it I'll figure out later. And then I never really... I just think I'm too solitary a person to work like that, Are you a planner or a seat of your pants writer? Oh my God, I'm such a planner. Like color-coded spreadsheets. I mean, different apps. I'll try. There's a new timeline app. Sure, I'll try that. Everything. Anything to just play with it a bit. I write pretty detailed outlines. I'm very happy to discard the outline if it's not working for me. I will not be a slave to it. And I will happily rewrite it, an outline, and go again. But I prefer to work with a plan. Otherwise, I get very excited and I feel like it's going brilliantly and I'll be writing and then I'll go, oh my God, I've got to cut 30,000 words. So that's killer. So I've learned through hard experience that it's a good mix of planning and allowing it to be organic that kind of works for me. In The Murder Rule, the biggest twist, which I won't give away, was completely organic. I was only like a chapter away from writing that scene. I went, oh, what if? And it's funny how sometimes that stuff lands, because the best of them just feel like, oh my God, that was there all along and I just found it. It was baked in and it forms part of the story. That's really lovely when that happens. It's very exciting, I know a lot of writers don't, because they feel like the voice might come in, whereas I'm like, great, the voice might come in. I steal from the best every time. I sort of feel like, and that does happen, if I'm reading somebody I love, I think my tone and voice changes a little bit in that moment for those couple of days that I'm on that book. But it's rewritten so many times. I rewrite, and the tone has to be consistent throughout. So it all smooths its way out. And I feel like I want to keep learning, so I don't want to cut myself off from that. Plus, it's always been a great pleasure. I wouldn't like to be, I'm always writing. So if I didn't read when I was writing, I would never read. The last novel I finished was Sulari Gentle's The Woman in the Library, which is brilliant. I mean, it's just brilliant. It's just a joy of a read. It's so clever and wry, and it's got this sharp sense of humor. It's about these 3 strangers who are in Boston Public Library, and there's a scream. And nobody's found initially, although it turns out a woman has died. And they kind of formed a sort of amateur detective squad. And at the same time, there's this other subplot weaving its way through, where the writer of that library story is corresponding with someone who's kind of helping her with her research, and that becomes its own thing. But it's not even the subject matter. It's a book for book people. There are all these little clever little nods, and it's just very clever and funny. I really enjoyed it, so I can't recommend it enough. What's next for me is another novel, Standalone, which I am writing at the moment, and I'm quite a way into it. I better be or I'm in trouble. And it's about a young couple who are very much in love and very beloved by their community. They're not the flashiest or showiest of people, but they're just nice people, and their romance has kind of captured people's imagination, and they're just very beloved. And their parents, both sets of parents, are quite embedded in the community as well. And then this young couple go away on a trip, and only he comes back. And he doesn't say a whole lot. He gives a basic rundown of what happened, but there's enough in that for people to go, really? Does that? But what? But how? And there are questions. But his parents immediately close ranks to protect him without even asking him any questions, really. Her parents are desperate to know what's happened to her. And then the action sort of takes off from there. And as it all starts to unravel, some more secrets are exposed. So it's a work in progress, but it's getting there, I think. Thank you. Thank you very much for watching and listening and reading. Appreciate it.